Very good. My name is Tim. I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Tim.
For those of you who like facts and figures, my date of sobriety is the 24th of July 1993. My current home group is in London, in East London. I know there's a sort of habit in AA in lots of places of stating one's home group very proudly. I've been to my home group every day for the last 35 years. I think one can get very attached to groups, and I'm not sure that's a good thing. So I mix it up occasionally and disappear and just go somewhere else. Alcoholics, I think, are sticky. I stick to things and I make them my own and I get identified with them. And once I'm identified with them, I start to scan for threats to them and then I become controlling. And one doesn't want that. What else? So what are we going to do? Well, I'm going to talk about the dreaded word relationships and the second dreaded word work. I'm going to split it into two halves. We're going to have a 15-minute break in the middle. If people look too restive and exhausted, we may finish earlier. This may be split 50-50 between relationships and work. If there are so many feverish questions about relationships that the ask it basket is overflowing, we may do more on relationships than work. What I'd encourage you to do is, as this is proceeding, to think about any material which is coming down the tubes, as it were, and think about questions you might have, particularly questions that you don't want to ask, questions that you wouldn't want to convey to your sponsor in case the answer came in the form of a suggestion. Because then you'd know you were going against the suggestion. Ask the dangerous, difficult questions, make it legible, or I will have no clue what you're saying. And if you need to go on to a third or a fourth piece of paper for the question is too long. Try to keep it to one line. Now, the topic I was given was relationships and then work. And I want to say a tiny little bit about relationships. Clancy would say on some of his recordings that there was that terrible moment when things are going frightfully well with your sponsee and then they phone you up and they say, I've got something to confess, and you say, what, Sonny? And the person says, I'm in a relationship. And you know that there's dirty work afoot. I was told when I was new in AA that whenever I'm interacting with anyone, I'm in a form of relationship with them. I have relationships with the people in the corner shop, the people sitting opposite me on the tube. I have relationships with everyone. I have relationships with people with whom I'm not interacting. If there is anything going on in my head which has you in it, I'm in a relationship with you, whether or not you're in a relationship with me. And it really covers everything. So this workshop is therefore on everything. Now, there will be a more specific focus on what is referred to as the relationship with the capital R. Now, if you're German, this will make less sense because everything is capitalized in German, because everything is important and needs to be capitalized. Whereas in English, only a few things are important. So there's the relationship with the lowercase r, then there's the relationship with the uppercase r, and we are of the erroneous belief that the relationship with the uppercase r is far more important than anything else, that you'll die if you don't have one. So there will be more of a focus on relationships with a capital R. One small warning for... Is there anyone in their first year? Okay, so there are a few. Now, I know that you're all already in romantic relationships with people, but on the off chance that you're not yet, the advice given to me, which I think was very sound, was stay out of the bedroom department until you've completed step 9. And the reasoning was because romantic relationships, and it was true for me, were really part of my whole addictive system and very distracting. There's also the problem that until I was reconstructed, every time I tried to have a romantic relationship, it became a historic reenactment of all of the previous relationships, with me trying to make the ending change. And of course the ending doesn't change because the raw material is the same. I kept picking the same people. At one point it was so bad that the names of the people I was dating rhymed with each other. This is a sign that there is a pattern. A friend of mine said that when he was driving the 5th girlfriend in a row to the emergency room after a suicide attempt in 1 year, he realised that perhaps that his picker was broken. So it's a good idea to do some reconstructive work before embarking on project relationship. But also, and this is a serious point, not everyone in AA makes it, the evidence suggests. People drink sometimes, and when they drink, they sometimes don't come back. And what I don't want to be is part of someone else's relapse story, which is why I was told to stay away from the romantic and relationship department with other people in AA for a good long while, so that I wouldn't end up in a position where I think, if only I hadn't got into that sexual deal with that person, maybe they wouldn't have relapsed. Now, of course, their recovery is their responsibility, but one doesn't want even the hint of that. Also, relationships in AA, in my experience, can produce an awful lot of controversy. I won't go into details about that. But to create controversy in the very place which I need to remain in to save my life is not a good idea. I'm very wordy, as you've already realised. My first sponsor, Doug, was more succinct. He said, "Don't shit where you eat, princess." So if one must relieve tension in the first year or so, or first couple of years in the romantic or sexual department, get on the tube, get on the U-Bahn, go to a completely different part of Berlin, find people who are not yet sober and fool around with them. Just keep the world separate. Now, on the question of relationships with a small r, the late, great... Oh, by the way, I think we can conclude, are the select few of those attending the convention who have recognised that we have problems in the area of relationships and work. We now know that all the other people have got that completely down. They're fine, they're good to go, there is nothing to discuss, there is nothing to learn, so you get 7 points each for even being here. And just one point about, this isn't Alcoholics Anonymous convention. I do need to mention something about drinking. When I drink, I can be going for years. I relapsed in 1991. It was 1993 before I drew a proper sober breath again. I need to stay away from alcohol very badly. But what happens when I'm sober without a program is I separate myself physically and mentally from everyone in my life until I'm living in a kingdom consisting just of me. And in that kingdom, there is no input, there is no wisdom, there is no common sense, there is no life, there is just me. And eventually a drink will seem to me like a very, very good idea. And because I'm following my own advice, I will take that drink. Reason has nothing to do with it. And this problem of the isolation in the prison of self, I think, is what the rest of the programme, all of the programme after step 1, is there to solve. A friend of mine called Dan describes it very well. He said that he lived in Danville, population 1, listening to Dan FM talk radio. So to be sober, I need to be connected to about a power greater than myself. In other words, God, which is the word for that, regardless of what the word might mean elsewhere. Here, I think the word God means that power greater than myself, which is the source of two things, of knowledge of what to do and the power to carry that out. But God, I don't think, works directly with me some of the time. I think God works through other people, which means having good relations with all the people in my life, as far as that is possible. To have a good relationship, it's like a border crossing. Both sides need to have the border posts manned and properly operated. You can have your border nice and open on your side. If the other side is not playing ball, the other side is not playing ball. But I have to have good relationships in as far as I can with everyone in my life for those channels to God to be open, which means that relationships are the core of this whole deal. And if you need a footnote reference for that, it's in step 8 in the 12 and 12 steps and 12 traditions, which is, as it were, the companion volume to the big book, where it says that defective human relationships are at the root of all of our problems, and it adds, interestingly, including our alcoholism. Very, I think, fascinating point. It doesn't elaborate how or why, it just says that and leaves you to figure it out. Good old Bill. So, problems with relationships. Now, the late, great speaker Sandy B, who is very well worth listening to repeatedly, would say that in one's relationships with other people, there are only two causes of problem. And I think this is, first of all, very helpful, because certainly when I got into AA, I was under the impression that I had 47,000 different types of problem with other people. He says, no, there are two. The first one is that I resent you. The second one is that I have harmed you. And the two solutions to this are forgiveness and amends. And when they talk about cleaning one side of the street, I think this is what they mean. In my consciousness, I like the word resentment, I even more like the word grievance. I develop lists of grievances. You know, in the workplace, one can have a grievance and then start a whole procedure where you make lots of other people do lots of work because you have a grievance. Everyone's kept very busy by the grievance. And I do that in my life. I develop grievances towards other people. And this, of course, although it starts in my mind, tips over into my behaviour, into my conduct with other people. Secondly, harming other people and not admitting it and not clearing up my mess, but wanting everything to carry on as normal. And for years and years and years, I had a very rough first 10 or 11 years in AA. Now, that's not to put anyone off, because the reason for that was not because of AA. It's because I took what I wanted and left the rest. And of course, the things that I left included the things that I needed. Because what I need, I don't want. That's my problem. And the thing that I desperately needed was forgiveness of others. And people, for whatever reason, in AA call me about matters arising. And one of the common openers of such conversations is this: I'm full of resentment. And I've said this many times, I'm full of resentment, as though I'm a little pot and someone has taken resentment and poured it into me, not recognising that I am the one that is creating this resentment. And then I will say to someone, well, what are you doing about it? And they'll say, I've written it out. I've written out my inventory, because we're taught in step 4 to write out the inventory. And a few years ago, my other half, who I've been with for 20 years, is not in AA and is not in Al-Anon and is staying very, very clear of this convention this weekend, let me tell you. He did something and I pulled a face, and he said, what are you going to do? Write a little column about it. So I'll say to people, what are you doing about your resentment? They say, well, I've written my columns. Shall I read them? And of course, one's heart sinks at the thought of having to listen to yet another column. And I said, well, you've written some writings, you've got some words, very good. What are you doing about the resentment? And that's it. I had the belief for a long time that if one wrote about it and read out the words, it would achieve something. And I don't think it does. What it achieves is making this nebulous grievance in my mind now fully concrete on a sheet of paper. There's a small amount of relief in having articulated it, but all that does is enable me to go around explaining it more clearly to other people. It doesn't actually get rid of it. It's like opening up it's like there's a funny smell in the kitchen, and finally you realise it's the bin in the corner. So what you do, you open up the lid and you make a list of all of the things in the bin, and then you shut the lid again, and then you wonder why the kitchen still smells. You've got to take it out. And it's like that with resentment. How do I take it out? Well, the first thing I have to do, and this was very difficult, to realise I'm never, ever resentful because of what someone else has done. I'm never resentful because of what someone else has done. If anyone has the grace or blessing or possibly misfortune to undertake a course in miracles, one of the lines is, you are never upset for the reason you think. I thought I was upset because of you, because of the government, because of a particular political party, because of the country that I grew up in or failed to grow up in, because of my social background, because of being shunted from one school to another, because of suicidal tendencies, because of my genetics, because of my brother's suicide, because of my alcoholism, because of your alcoholism, because of other people's behaviour, because of geography, because of the Cold War, because of 1,000 other threats. When I grew up in the 1970s and 80s, and I remember as a child with an atlas and a pair of compasses drawing circles around possible target sites for nuclear bombs to work out where the safest place to live in the UK would be. I was doing this at the age of 8. I had a problem and it was out there. It was your fault. What I learned in AA and Al-Anon, just sliding that in there. What I learned in what's Al-Anon, I'll ask someone in the break. The problem is not you, the problem is me. How? The only reason I'm upset is because your behaviour or the external circumstance or the distorted memory from the past is clashing with my idea of how things ought to be. And in the big book on page 62, there's a very good passage where it says that you can't rely on God and play God at the same time. Which means that if I am running through the world with a fixed idea of how things ought to be, constantly comparing the world to my fixed idea of how things are going to be, I'm going to be full of grievance. I'm going to be full of unhappiness. And the only way to get rid of the grievance is not to say, I'm right, my plan is good, everything will be fine if only everyone else obeyed me. But the poor wretches can't. So I'm going to say the sick man prayer, the poor little wretch is sick, so I shall feel sorry for him, but I'm still right. That doesn't get rid of it. That papers over it. That's like a 14-year-old who, rather than having a shower, sprays Lynx on themselves. I think it's called something else here. Axel, is that what it's called? So rather than washing, you spray, and that's how that prayer can be misused. To treat other people as spiritually inept, that one must feel sorry for them because they don't have the ability to reach the spiritual heights that we have. The earthlings haven't learned what we've learned in recovery. To me, that's never shifted a resentment out of my system. All it's done is turned it into self-righteousness and conceit, and a subtle sense, or not so subtle sense of superiority. So the first stage in getting rid of the resentment is to recognise it's coming not from their behaviour, it's coming from my demands. And the demand must be dropped. And once the demand is dropped, I have a hope in hell's chance of being at peace. Secondly, to recognise that even if other people are behaving badly, and the book does not deny this, so this is not a case of, as it's called, victim blaming, as though in any situation there is only one dollop of guilt and you have to work out who it is, and the person that has the guilt has all the guilt. That's not what this is about. The book is very clear in saying the world and its people are often quite wrong. So they can be wrong and I can have a demand at the same time. But if I get rid of the demand, the fact that you're wrong is now irrelevant. I can blind myself to it. My other half, who I get most of my material from, frankly, said forgiveness is very good, but forgetting is even better. If you don't notice it, it can't bother you. So to recognise that when other people behave badly, it is simply, as is the case with me, that they are driven by self. That's the only reason I will behave badly. When I do something wrong, I'm the one that is responsible for that. When I'm doing something right, it is only by the grace of God and the wisdom of AA that I'm able to do those things. There's an asymmetry there. We're not the first to discover this. If you read The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser, there's one of the stanzas is precisely about that. The harm that I do comes from me trying to live separately from God in my own little tin pot kingdom, trying to create for myself in the world an identity, a permanence in an ever-changing world. Impossible. That's where the ill comes from. The good comes from me forgetting myself and saying, God, can you do something through me? I can't do anything with this raw material. So when other people behave badly, they are doing what I do when I behave badly. So it's not those poor wretches down there are sick. They, like us, have very bad days. That's it. I'm in no position to separate myself from others with grievance or with superiority. Next, to develop, and this is a dangerous word, love for other people. Now that can mean all sorts of revolting things. And I don't mean sex, I mean all of those dreadful entanglements and caretaking and management and manipulation and mothering and martyrdom and all of those other things we learn about in Al-Anon. Love, as I've been shown it in AA, is a detached benevolence towards others, looking upon others in a kindly and accepting way and wishing them well and looking for opportunities to further the good of others. So it's not about feeling, really, so much, or sentiment, as it is about a benevolent attitude and benevolent action. So to develop love, when there is love coming out from me towards other people, then nothing can come back. It is unopposable. It's rather like in those, well, you see it in various things. You see it in Star Wars and you see it in the Harry Potter films, where one person has got a wand which is pointed in someone's direction. There's a beam of light coming from the wand, and then there's someone with a wand on the other side. If the love is strong enough, whatever is coming at me can't get to me. And that's what I've learned in AA. This is the solution to grievance. And if practiced, and one can practice it all day, every day, by simply looking at a person, and one must be very careful about this. This is another idea from the Course in Miracles, not to make any exceptions to the rule, is to look at anyone that one sees and to bless them. Say, spend 5 minutes on the train or in the street. You see someone, whoever comes across your gaze, bless them, wish them well, see them as a perfect child of God, of incalculable value. And to practice that consistently, if one's programme consisted only in that, I think it would be the whole solution. As Dr. Bob said, love and service is what this whole thing boils down to. That's the first aspect of relationships. The second aspect is the elimination of past harms, or the resolution of past harms, by the simple fact of making amends. When I was 15 or so years sober, it came to my attention that although I'd done much work on steps 8 and 9 over the years, I had in fact completed steps 8 and 9 to the best of my awareness and consciousness around 1 or 2 years sober. My consciousness was not very well developed. So I'd miss, and that's not to be mean to myself, but one is not aware of certain things. I wasn't self-deceptive in any kind of childish way. I just genuinely didn't see things. Plus, over many years in AA, all sorts of things built up, which I justified in order that I needn't make amends for them. 15 years sober, I did really a complete list, which was much more thorough than the first time. And I had between 70 and 80 people on it, and I just cleared the list of amends in 10 days or so. I got it done. I didn't get it done elegantly or even particularly well, but it was done sincerely, and I think that's the bit that counts. And my sense of having a problem with the world went promptly when the last amend was completed. And the sense of having to build an identity and a presence in the world went as well. You see, trying to tackle a problem, if the problem won't go, often there's a problem upstream of the problem, which is the reason why the problem is there in the first place. Upstream of my whole attempt to create an identity in the world, to work out who I was and make something of myself, was a compensation for the underlying guilt for all of the harms I had never amended. Once no one had anything on me anymore, because I'd done my utmost to straighten out the past, there was really nothing else to prove. so I could for the first time get on with the question of doing God's will, because I didn't have any more plans. All of the plans were coming from unresolved guilt, it turned out. No way that could have been discerned from the surface, but that's where it came from. With regard to relationships, I'm going to talk chiefly about my relationship with my other half. I had a previous relationship with someone in AA once we were both sober and had done the steps for about 8 years in my first 10 years, and then I had 20 years with someone else. The first 9 steps clear the ground for me to be able to have a hope of having healthy relationships with people. And then the last 3 steps provide the daily basis. And step 11 is embarrassingly unambitious. It asks me merely to go to God in the morning and say, what do you want me to do today? And then I go through the day and do it. And in step 10, I make sure I do that and don't do other things. I get to step 11 at night. I ask God to show me what I did wrong, what I did badly, what I did well, what I need to do differently tomorrow, and then I simply get on with it the next day. Someone said to me many years ago, and this was enormously helpful, he said, I don't know how to have a healthy sick relationship. Which means that the sick relationships I had could not be fixed or solved or patched up or injected with something, because the basis for them was sick. Now, what does that mean? What does a sick relationship mean? I made the mistake of asking, and the person said, a sick relationship is any relationship you want something out of. And the chief thing that I wanted out of relationships, specifically romantic relationships, was to mend my wounded self-esteem. And I thought it was someone else's job to do that, to make me feel ... fill in the blank. And I thought that relationships were the thing that would fill up the emptiness, that would make me feel complete and make me feel whole. But there's a line in a Sondheim musical, I think it's Into the Woods, a slotted spoon doesn't hold much soup. And I was a slotted spoon. You can pour as many people as you want into me. It will not touch the sides. It'll simply splatter everywhere. I never felt whole. I never felt right. Maybe for a couple of minutes, but then the cold wind would start to blow and I would feel cheated and failed by the other person. And I would attribute the failure to their defects, which now would start to become manifest. I'd sold them a bill of goods and I thought they had sold me a bill of goods. I thought I could exchange my worthlessness for your value, and that somehow I would be up on the transaction. But because I felt so bad about myself, I knew that I was giving you something in exchange which wasn't worth anything. So I didn't respect you for failing to see through it. And then when I realised you were doing exactly the same, you see, you can't fix that. Another line which was very helpful was about relationships. Don't get into a relationship with someone unless you want to forgive and serve, unless you feel that there aren't enough opportunities in your life for forgiveness. So you've run through all of your grievances and resentments. You have none left, but you'd like to practice forgiveness some more. Have a relationship. If you feel that that you've got far too much time on your hands and you need to devote yourself and sacrifice your own objectives and plans and designs in order to further someone else's, and to help them achieve what is important in their lives, then go and have a relationship. If you can happily fulfill both of these criteria, tick both of these boxes, full steam ahead. If not, there might be work to do. And so the model of my relationship with my other half is very much like the model of AA itself, and this is where the traditions come in. So that the steps clear the way for me to have relationships with others. The traditions provide a framework by which that can be carried out. And the two pillars, I think, of AA, in my view, are tradition 1 and tradition 5. And 5 really stands at the centre of things. In other words, it's not up there. Tradition 5, this idea that we have a common purpose, and that in tradition 1, it is that purpose that is to be served, because that is what best serves the individual rather than the other way round. So the individual is important, but the individual is best served by the vessel of AA being preserved. So that's the idea of tradition 1 of unity. And tradition 5 having a purpose. And someone sent Jonathan and me an anniversary card a number of years ago, and it was of a rowing boat, or a small boat, which was floating down a river. And in the prow of the boat, the front of the boat, there were 2 dogs sitting out, looking proud, both looking ahead, which is very interesting, not looking at each other, looking ahead, but next to each other. And I thought this was a brilliant image for relationships. If 2 dogs, if you've ever seen dogs paddling, they can swim, but they ain't great at it. They're obviously not built for swimming. It wasn't, it's not the most elegant thing in the world. Me trying to make it through the world on my own, I can do it, but it's not elegant. But with the 2 of you, something else is created, which is the vessel. And that will simply carry the 2 people through the world with very little effort, a touch of the rudder. That's all. Sometimes people talk about working on relationships. I have to say, if you want to learn about working on relationships, you're in the wrong workshop. Adam, it's not too late to change one of the workshops this afternoon to working on... I've never worked on a relationship in my life. And the other thing which is that strikes, it makes my blood run backwards when someone says something like, we need to talk about our relationship. I do not talk about my relationship with Jonathan to Jonathan. I've never done it. He refuses as well. I'll come to that in a moment. But the image of the boat going down the river, and the most important thing is unity. And the purpose is for us to have a stable environment from within which we can go and fulfill our respective missions in the world. I used to think when Jonathan would come home from work and not want to talk about work, that I was being shut out of it. But for him, the home, the relationship was the safe place within which he needn't talk or think about work. I misinterpreted completely. But unity is the most important thing, which means we don't shoot holes in the bottom of the boat. And my best story on this is one which I apologise to people who've heard it before. It's the washing up story. I was doing the dishes about 17 or 18 years ago, and I'd realised that I had done the dishes every single time for weeks, possibly months, and it might possibly be Jonathan's turn to do the dishes. So I started to do the dishes very loudly to communicate, because who needs words when you have dishes? To communicate that it was possibly his turn to do the dishes and not mine. And this produced no effect. So I decided to up the ante and say, it wouldn't hurt if you did the dishes occasionally. Skillful, isn't it? Understated. I looked over to see what effect this was having. He looked slightly paler than usual, and he left the room. And I thought, I'm in very deep trouble now. And I'd be ready for some questions in just a moment, Aaron.
I'll be right down.
Very good. And 10 minutes later, and I think those were possibly the longest 10 minutes of my life, he came back into the room and he said, I have never, ever criticized you. I could make a list as well. I realized that everything I had done in the previous 2 or 3 years had been spotted and overlooked. Because the period of assessment, what do I like, what do I not like, was over the moment we entered into the relationship. Once we were in, there was a commitment to it. This is the person I'm with, that is the end of it. No criticism under any circumstances. And one of the big principles that we follow is that we never ever suggest what you did made me feel X. There is very occasionally a polite request, in future it would be helpful if you could ... But never ever emotional blame, making someone else responsible for how I feel. And it is that, above everything else, that forms the basis for unity, and frankly, simplicity. And so I said, we never talk about the relationship, we never work on the relationship. And I think the reason why is because we both want to make it work, so there's nothing to talk about. We talked about many people we know who have conflict in relationships, and I said to Jonathan once, why do you think other people argue? And he said, they must like it. And I said, why don't we argue? And he said, because we don't like it. If it's happening, it's because I like it. And it won't go until I start to dislike it, until I'm willing to let go of the apparent gain in doing the thing, whether it's arguing or whatever, criticism. Can I have a question or two?
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe before do you mind if I just let people know, because I think some folks came after we introduced, so just to let folks know, there will be a 15-minute break, which will probably come not too far from now. There is an Ask It basket, so that's what's been passing around. Some people have been putting Seventh Tradition in it. It's an Ask It basket, so if you have a question about relationships, you can put that in the basket. There's one still going around. We will be picking up more questions, and so you do still have time to write a question.
Okay, so some of these questions have got a short answer and then a long answer. If they've got a long answer, I'm going to put them to one side, and if we run out of things to talk about, I'll come back to them. What is a spiritual awakening? Nice handwriting, by the way. What is a spiritual awakening? What is it to be spiritually asleep? I think they can both be summed up. Actually, I will treat them separately. What is a spiritual awakening? In a sense, this is what the whole weekend is about. However, there was a moment when I was a number of years sober when I realised that other people were real. What is it to be spiritually asleep? Those of you with WhatsApp, will notice that sometimes you write a message to someone and within half a second it says, Susan is typing. Like, there's been no thought, there's been no consideration, immediately we're into responding. And when I'm spiritually asleep and there is important information coming down the tubes, either events or communication or whatever, I'm not letting it in. I'm just reacting in accordance with a preset algorithm. Which is why I think the most useful tool in the program is pausing, to let things in, to let things interact, to let things settle, and not simply to process them at arm's length and straight out the other side again. Ooh, very good. Okay, can you describe a healthy sponsor relationship as a sponsee? I think that could be asked both ways around. And when is one ready to be a sponsor? So I've been sponsoring for over 30 years now. It was a little period for a few months once where I didn't have any, but essentially I've been sponsoring continuously for that period. And there are lots of stories. I'm going to do the second one first. When is one ready to be a sponsor? Ideally, one will have completed step 9 and be practicing 10, 11 and 12 on a daily basis. However, in most places, those who have actually completed every last amend are rarer than hen's teeth. That's a very good phrase if you're picking up English idioms, rarer than hen's teeth. And so people who haven't yet completed step 9 are needed to be sponsors because there simply aren't enough sponsors to go around. Also, frankly, a lot of people get bogged down in 8 and 9. And if you're sponsoring other people, it actually produces a lot of energy to get your own step work done because it's so embarrassing when a sponsee overtakes you. So you want to stay ahead of them. So I think once you've made some amends and you've started to make actual changes, no change really happens until steps 8 and 9. Once you're making actual changes in your life, you're putting your money where your mouth is by making amends, you're ready. Do you feel ready? Feeling has got nothing to do with it. Because the thing is, you're not someone's therapist. Can I just repeat, you are not their therapist. So if you know how the early steps work and what actions to take, you can be a sponsor. If you can give basic input on meetings and fellowship and service, you're ready. The person is not your responsibility. When I'm a sponsor, I'm not responsible for them. I'm responsible for delivering content to them as guided by my higher power. That is it. And when I said that I've been sponsoring continuously, as I said it, I thought it's the wrong word. It should be continually. Because what I've been taught is that, let's say, at a particular point in time, I have 10 sponsees or 20 sponsees or 30 sponsees. I don't. If I'm literally talking to a sponsee, in that moment, I am their sponsor. As soon as the conversation is over and the phone has been put down and the room has been left, I'm not sponsoring them. And a sick sponsor relationship is when one conceives of one's sponsees as this sort of extension of oneself, as though they're one's sort of property or responsibility. They're not. If someone contacts me for input, I give them the input back out the door again, so that I remain intact as a person. And from the point of view of a healthy sponsee relationship, so I've had the same sponsor for about 15 years now. And frankly, the style of sponsorship has been the same all the way through, right from the beginning. my early sponsors never called me. They waited for me to call them. They didn't cluck round me like hens. They were there in their lives. If I called, they would answer. And if they couldn't, I would leave a message and they would call me back. And that's fine. But they would not come into my little cave to keep me company in the cave. My sponsors' love for me is expressed not with sentiment, but with the provision of useful feedback. That will not feel loving when it comes down the tubes. When I call my sponsor, I brace for impact. If I've got a problem, the solution is going to appear unpleasant, disagreeable, disgusting, revolting, objectionable, outrageous. And I'm prepared for that now. So when I'm told the thing I don't want to hear, I write it down because I won't remember it otherwise. And I say, thank you very much. And I don't argue. The 4 things I avoid in discussions with my sponsor are what are called Jedi mind tricks, Jedi, justification, explanation, defense, and expression of intentions. To take those from the last, I never need to express, I'm going to do the step work today. No. Because if I'm going to do it, the intention won't make any difference. My sponsor doesn't need to know. He's not writing down my schedule. He doesn't need to know what I'm doing. Rather than intending to do it, I need to just go away and do it. Justification, explanation, and defense. No one needs it. Every single sponsor I've had, although their temperaments and characters have been quite different, every single one of them at some point has used the phrase, business is business. There's got to be emotional detachment on both sides. As a sponsor, if I care whether my sponsee likes me or not, or is going to cuddle up to me at fellowship after the meeting, if I worry about what my sponsee is going to say to other people, if I worry that they're going to report my input at a group somewhere, I'm going to hold back saying the one thing which might save their life. Now, this isn't carte blanche to be unpleasant unnecessarily. So I don't like the phrase, I care more about whether you live or die than about your feelings. One tries to deliver with the best will in the world in as tactful a way as one can. But we're not professionals, and we don't need to be. I don't need to be like a mill pond. I'm a human being. And also, one tiny little thing on this. When I was new, and I would phone up people with antagonistic or foolish questions, and people sounded annoyed, this was a very useful piece of feedback, because I'd been in front of professionals who were trained not to show any emotion in response to my behaviour. I didn't learn anything from them about what was acceptable and what wasn't acceptable, what was childish and what was grown up. In AA, when I was dicking people around and they reacted emotionally, they weren't sick. They were just being regular human beings feeding back very useful information. So my sponsor is a human being. He's not to be equated with a professional. And we'll have a little break after this one. Living amends versus direct amends is either okay. I have no opinion on what is okay or not okay. I'll convey what the programme says as far as I understand it and what I've done. What the steps say is that I make direct amends wherever possible. Now that means to the person. And one of the interesting things about the way the book lays this out, it says, we wish to lay down no rule whatsoever, and amends may take innumerable forms. And I think we're very good these days in AA, certainly better than 30 years ago, in terms of information, instructions and worksheets and all of those things. I think it's very good. But it can make it mechanical sometimes. It can take the inspiration and intuition out of it. So if I've got a problem with someone, I need to make amends directly. That means my side of that relationship needs to be adjusted somehow. Now, most of the time, that is going to need to be done with a verbal apology. There are certain types of harm where to do some kind of verbal amend would actually embed the harm even more. A good example is my mother, God rest her soul, she died earlier this year. She had a bit of a rough time of it. She's not British, she was born in Europe, and her father was in concentration camps. She and her mother had a very rough war, very troubled family relationships. My mother's had 5 children. I'm the only one left out of 5. My mother's relationship with me was problematic in lots of ways. And she was, I don't like to say this, but she's died, but she was a little bit controlling occasionally. And she very much wanted her life to be fulfilled through me. Because the other 4 children, that wasn't going to happen because they were dead. And this placed an awful lot of pressure on me, and to keep my sanity, I had to distance myself in various ways. I just couldn't deal with it. Until I learned how to deal with it, and then it was fine. The relationship resolved completely in the last 15 years or so. But she resented me greatly for not loving her, apparently, as much as she had loved her mother. And she would accuse me, you're only showing up and coming to family things, coming to stay with me because you feel as though you ought to, your heart isn't in it, blah, blah, blah. And that was the nature of the harm, that there was a fraudulence there, that there was a gap between the fact I was behaving well, but the feeling wasn't there. She was absolutely right. Now, if I'd said to her, absolutely right, for the last 15 years, I've been play acting a good son, I haven't much cared to come and see the family, but here I am because I'm good. There's no way you can have that conversation and hope that healing is going to come out the other side of it. So I had to turn this over. There were lots of amends to my mother, which I did verbally make amends for, but in my first run of amends when I was a year sober. But this one, no, couldn't be done. I said to the higher power, this is going to need to change through your agency. I cannot fix this. I cannot verbalize it. And over the 15 years that followed that step 8 experience, the relationship with her was transformed by the higher power. And in the last 5 or 6 years, my other half and I looked after my mother for the last few years of her life. We were in contact every day. We took her out. She resolved everything from her past, very quietly, very privately, but with us, as it were, witnessing that the whole thing was resolved in God's hands. I don't think the question is really an either-or question. One makes direct amends wherever possible, where if you can't find someone, it needs to be indirect. If they're dead, it needs to be indirect. If there is something that is too indiscreet to say, it needs to be indirect. But in any case, even if one makes direct amends, one must still then act right towards the person for the rest of their life and for the rest of your life. And that already comes under step 12, this notion of acting optimally with the people in my life. That's not an amend, that's simply practicing a spiritual life 10, 11 and 12 on a daily basis. But the question of the harm needs to be dealt with one way or another. If it can't be done directly, then, for instance, with indirect amends, there are innumerable forms. There's working for charities, there's finding proxy people. For instance, one can't help an elderly relative because they've died, so one finds other people in one's life who are placed there, apparently by the higher power, to be the people that one can help instead. I've had lots of those experiences. But the danger with this living amends business, it can be used as justification for not actually making a real amend. So it's very much under the guidance of God. Let's have a 15-minute break. We'll come back at 25 to the hour. But let's have a little serenity prayer before we get to him. So, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.